Before we start our lecture on John Winthrop, I wanted to take you back to the week one lecture. As you're reading, I asked you to take a look at two things while you're reading the two texts by Winthrop. The first one was when you're reading A Model of Christian Charity, he's making those several parallels between the New Colony and the Old Testament Hebrews. We talked about typology and what that meant. It was very heavily rooted in the Puritan doctrine, where they compared events to events from the Bible and took lessons from the Bible and applied those to living within the colonies. And so he does that with the city on the hill analogy in A Model of Christian Charity. I want you to explain what Winthrop meant by this analogy. What does that city on a hill mean? And what was his overall purpose? And then in the excerpt from the journal, he is discussing these occurrences that happened during his time as governor in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And I wanted you to kind of make some notes on the specific behaviors that Winthrop expected of the colonists who were part of the covenant community, and what were the consequences of failure that he had during and when of people that failed to keep that covenant with God. So we're going to leave that, and we're going to go to our text notes that I made for you on John Winthrop, and we're going to start with A Model of Christian Charity. So A Model of Christian Charity is basically a sermon that, well, I'm sorry, I'm trying to find it really quick. I've got like 20,000 tabs open here. Model of Christian Charity is a sermon that Winthrop preached before leaving on the Arabella to come to the New World. And basically, it was intended to be not only a sermon, but also kind of a pep talk and a survival guide for those colonists. And his purpose in writing was to warn, really, the settlers about the cost of failure. What would happen if they were not successful in the New World, and some instructions on how to live moral lives by the Puritan doctrine. And it is literally filled with Bible passages and Bible stories that he used to support his points. That is that whole idea of typology and that Puritan doctrine as he is preaching this sermon. So what he envisioned for the Massachusetts Bay Colony was that it would be a city on a hill. And the exact text wording is a simile that he uses in his text, for we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. And that actually has a biblical source from the Bible, Matthew 5:14 and 5:15. You're the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are all in the house. So according to that passage, the biblical passage, a city on the hill possesses two characteristics: brightness, so it's like a candle that giveth light unto the house, and visibility, it cannot be hid. And it seems that Winthrop had the idea of visibility at the forefront of his mind, because he says the eyes of all people are upon us. And guys, he was not expecting this colony to be some glorious living. He knew that it was going to be difficult living. He knew they were going to have many encounters and face a lot of hardships. This whole sermon is basically a warning that their failure would be catastrophic, in an effort to kind of goad them into living just lives so that God would not turn his back on them. If they could unite in love and care for one another, then the colony would be seen as a praise and a glory, and an example for the settlers who came after, for succeeding plantations. However, if they dealt falsely with God, if they did not fulfill their spiritual obligations, he would turn away from them. And then the colony would be seen as an example throughout the entire world, as an example of spiritual failure, which would embolden God's enemies It would shame God's worthy servants. It would lead them to curse the colony. And finally, it would cause the Puritans to be driven from the New World and their new home. So those things are really important for that text. If I were to ask you about the city on the hill and what that meant, wink, wink, then that would be something that you would put into consideration for that. So before we start talking about the journal of John Winthrop, so 400 Puritan immigrants went with Winthrop across on the Arabella in the spring of 1630. They landed in and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which would later become Boston. The settlement itself later became Boston many years later. They had a horrible journey. It was rough and hazardous. The Atlantic is very rough coming from where they were at in Britain. And so there was only one, this was the fourth attempt to colonize in the New World, and there was only one colony that was successful, and that was Jamestown at Plymouth Rock. But Jamestown never really grew in the way that they had hoped for. It was still very small and primitive, and so this was the fourth attempt, and there was a lot of pressure riding on the success of this colony for many reasons. So they land. They have a horrible winter. It killed almost 20% of the initial travelers, the initial settlers. And so it looked like it was going to fail. It looked like that it was going to collapse. However, they managed to make it through. And by the following winter, they had built up the colony and the neighboring areas into a pretty thriving community. The New World itself was dangerous. It had Indians were here. That was a whole other can of worms. The French and Spanish privateers were here. There were wild animals that these people had never before encountered in their lives. And then the weather on top of that they were not used to. But for Winthrop, none of that was as dire as the fact that the devil was present in the New World, and he had followed them from Britain to America. And so he spent much of his time preaching on the dangers of living outside of the Puritan way and not following the path, punishing people, heretics that tried to preach their own agendas, like Anne Hutchinson and Robin Williams. Jesus, take the wheel. Roger Williams. In the colony, and you'll see that is prominent in that journal. He didn't want anybody distracting his Puritans from getting to heaven, and so that was a critical piece. So in the journal entries, he discusses a wide variety of topics, the hardships that they faced, including disease, an earthquake, death. In the journal, but the main point was the two heretics, the two wayward settlers who crossed lines and had to be dealt with, and that was Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. And y'all, in all truth and sincerity, these people weren't doing wild things. They literally just believed in things that were a little bit different or veered from the Puritan path. And so these guys were having assemblies in their homes, and they were bringing in settlers and kind of giving them teachings and preaching and they called it misguided teachings. And they were just different from the Puritan core beliefs and the Puritan core teachings. So the bulk of this journal entry excerpt that we have is the cases of Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson especially. They punish her. They banish her from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and she's punished, and she is cast out of the colony to an outlying area of the away from the main town. While she is there, she goes on to give birth, and it's called a monstrous birth, to a seriously deformed child who did not survive. There's an earthquake that shakes the foundations of all their homes, and so basically what he is using in this journal is these examples so that the other settlers could see how dangerous it was to go against the church. He's basically blaming Miss Hutchinson and Roger Williams' deviation from God's path for this earthquake and for the deformity of the child. And so he goes on again to explain, hey, look, all eyes are upon us. This is how we need to be behaving. And that's where our journal entries. And this was a book. It was filled with these types of entries, so that the Puritan, to kind of just reinforce the way that these settlers should be living.